Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about chapters 1 and 2 from Johnson and Christensen Educational Research, starting with chapter 1, which is our Introduction to Educational Research. So the first thing that we come up with in the chapter is the importance of educational research and why it's important for students and educators to study it. So through building your expertise and your knowledge of educational research and the methods, it will help improve your overall educational practice by helping you come up with evidence to support your practice and develop the critical thinking skills that you need to evaluate claims and arguments that you're presented with, and help you become more savvy as you more critically analyze and review the research that you are presented with in the media or in your practice. So the beginning of the chapter starts off with a sample study, an example for you to see how educational research might impact you. And you might already have a lot of examples. Feel free to share if you do. So the next thing that we talked about in the chapter are the array of different topics in educational research. And this is important because this semester you will be crafting a research proposal. So you will need to have a research topic that you will explore. And there's many, probably hundreds of different topics in educational research. And the chapter talks about AERA, American Educational Researchers Association, which is comprised of many of these different areas. And I included just a few here. There's more in the text. So you might be interested in teacher-student relationships, digital media and education, curriculum development, maybe testing, evaluation, assessment, maybe sociocultural influences on learning, maybe something in student affairs, working with student athletes, or in higher education. So please share in the chat with us what research topics are you interested in, and it might be something that's not on this list, but something that you are interested in or could potentially want to include in your proposal. So another key concept in here, in addition to the different topics, are the types of research. And the first two that you need to understand are basic versus applied research. And basic research builds on foundational theories. It's important for a lot of the key concepts that we as educators act on all the time. So the purpose of basic research is to develop and theorize understanding of knowledge development, things like memory, motivation, everything that we learned about child development, those different stages are examples of basic research. Whereas applied research takes those concepts and studies them in a specific context. So understood in the real world, for instance, maybe comparing to teaching strategies or curricula. So that is the difference between basic research versus applied research. Basic research, general knowledge, and applied research to a specific setting, like a school, for instance. Now, we also have three other types. We have action research, evaluation research, and orientational research. Now, action research is a type of practitioner research. So this is something that practitioners do while doing their practice. So it's something that teachers do while teaching. It's something that nurses do while nursing that helps them solve problems in their practice to improve their practice. So an example might be collecting and analyzing data to understand the impact of implementing PBL in your classroom. Now, practitioner research, action research is done by teachers or the practitioner themselves. Evaluation research is similar in that you're trying to assess the quality of a program or improve it. However, it's not done by the practitioner itself. It's done by a third-party researcher. So for example, if you had an after-school program, or perhaps a lot of them, you might hire an evaluation researcher to come and evaluate the quality of the program or give you information, what's working, what needs to be improved. And then finally, orientational research, which is focused on reducing inequality, critiquing power structures. Sometimes we call this emancipation, giving a voice to the disadvantaged. So all of the research that is coming out of critical theory, feminism, critical race studies, gender studies. So an example in education might be examining a racial bias in curricular materials. So out of these, which type of research appeals to you and why? I personally, I love orientational research and am interested in examining particularly discourse and how power shows up in all different elements of educational policy to educational curricula, social media representations, and on and on. Okay, so when we are talking about research, we are making knowledge claims. So it's important to think about when we're understanding what research is and how research is designed to think about where does what we know come from? Where does knowledge come from? And when we are doing research, that is a referring to empiricism. So empiricism is knowledge that's gained through sensory observation, things that we can observe and collect evidence of, and our observations are the evidence. So, for example, you might be observing student engagement. You might say that would look like I know X because I saw it. And there's an example in the text. I know the car is blue because I observed it. So it relies on empirical research. Is predicated on this understanding, this requirement of empiricism. So it requires that you collect data and analyze that data. Now, quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods are all examples of empirical research because they all rely on observation of data that the researcher is collecting. Now, another source of knowledge is rationalism, and this is when knowledge is derived from logical reasoning. And so this is, again, not from observation, but from deduction. So an example, all teachers are mortal. John is a teacher, therefore John is mortal. So this would sound like I know because I deduced it, or I reasoned it through logic. So there are still non-empirical research studies that are considered a research, even though they don't rely on observation. So these types of academic works would be theoretical articles, logical arguments like philosophy, conceptual papers, theoretical papers that you will see. So in this course, we are going to be focusing on empirical research, empiricism, even though these are valid forms of research as well. Oh, and epistemology is the branch of philosophy that is focused on knowledge and how knowledge is justified. There's more about that in the text too. Okay, so now that we have talked about what empiricism means, empirical studies, we know that is what we are going to be learning about this semester. So within that, we have a particular scientific approach to knowledge generation that comes out of the tradition of empiricism. So there are several different topics here. So we have exploratory methods and then confirmatory methods. And this is going to layer on to what you learn in chapter 2 that I'm going to talk about soon, where we learn about research paradigms. So one approach to research is exploratory, bottom up. So you start by making observations in the real world. You look at the patterns, and based on the patterns that you have identified, you have your conclusions. So this can help you generate theories, ideas, understand experiences. So this is exploratory. Another type of research is confirmatory, top down. That's when you start with your hypothesis, you collect data to test your hypothesis, to test it, and then that collects evidence that either validates or rejects your theory. So bottom up, where you start with the data, then analyze and come up with your conclusions, or top down, where you start with your hypotheses, collect the data, and then test it to see if it matches it. So this might be something that you need to come back to when we come to research paradigms to make sure that you understand the different flow in research paradigms and the reason why you might do it and how it's carried out. Now, another very important point for this semester is the principle of evidence. So hopefully this draws your attention that I have struck through the word proof. So when we're talking about empiricism, and we are talking about collecting evidence for a particular claim. So we're not claiming that we can prove something. That's not a goal of research, that's not a goal of empirical research to prove something. Instead, your goal is to provide evidence to substantiate a particular claim. So science does not provide proof, but instead offers evidence through systematic inquiry in the testing of hypotheses. So that's something important. I know that in our oftentimes in our casual discourse, we say, oh, this study proved this. However, this study has evidence that this is true. So that's a really important disposition to have as a researcher and a critical consumer of research too, because if you see that, perhaps there is something more to it as it relates to scientific reasoning versus pseudoscience. So scientific reasoning relies on everything that I've been talking about: empirical observable evidence, providing sufficient justification, delimiting the scope, saying what the findings do not say. In academia, we rely on anonymous peer review. So the research, the empirical research, and well, really all types of research and scholarships that academics are doing, researchers are doing, is submitted to peer reviews. So the articles, once we get to our literature review, the articles that you're reading have been peer reviewed to ensure that the quality and the claims meet the standard that we have in the profession. And again, what I just mentioned, emphasize that there's evidence of justification and not final proof, whereas pseudoscience is focused on beliefs or practices that purport to be science, appealing to trust or faith, reverses the burden of proof, ignores other explanations, and overuses testimonials or anecdotal evidence. So this is something for you to hone your skills in this semester, to be more critical about the information that you are receiving and analyzing. So when you are looking at claims, is it empirical or observable? Has it been peer reviewed? Are there logical fallacies that you see there, like too much anecdotal evidence or ignoring any alternatives? And then if it is being positioned as universal, it applies to everything, would that be realistic based on the situation? And then the last concept in chapter 1 is about the different objectives, goals, or purposes of your research. And this is important because when we go into chapter 2 in understanding the different research paradigms, different research designs pair with different purposes. So that's really important to be aligned in your research. So one purpose is to explore. So as you can imagine, explore tends to go with exploratory design that are bottom up. Another purpose of research is to describe a phenomenon, to describe what's happening. Another purpose is to understand a phenomenon. Another one is to explain perhaps a process or something that's happening. The next one is to predict. So predict would be to understand, to analyze data, to understand what's probably going to happen in the future. And then last one is to influence, and this is kind of related to the idea of identifying cause and effect relationships. So it's really important you can think about your research topic, what type of research it is. Is it orientational research, applied research, practitioner research? So you've thought about your topic, the type of research that you are going to do, and then start to think about what is your purpose. Okay, and then we are on to chapter 2, which is comparing the different paradigms in education. Now, the concepts in chapter 2 are the foundation for the rest of the book, the rest of the semester. So a lot of these concepts we will continue to review, and keep chapter 2 in your back pocket as something that you might need to revisit throughout the semester to help you put the other chapters into context, because it's really important that by the end of the semester you have a really strong understanding about the difference between quantitative, qualitative, and mixed research. And eventually in your research proposal, you will choose one of these paradigms as your design for your proposal. Okay, so with the research paradigms, so we have qualitative, quantitative, and mixed research. So quantitative, when you think of research, I'm curious what you think of, with research. And for many of you, you probably think of quantitative research. So quantitative research is the scientific method that we use starting in elementary school that scientists still use, all about testing hypotheses. So quantitative research is top-down research. It seeks to analyze data based on that. So using numerical data, statistics, measurement, control group, experimental group, trying to come up with evidence to either confirm or reject a hypothesis. So for example, experiment testing new math teaching methods. Now, another type of research that you might not think of as often, but is just as valid in terms of presenting knowledge claims is qualitative research. And qualitative research focuses on human experiences, subjective human experiences. So it has a different goal than quantitative research. And so that's what I mentioned about understanding your purpose. Is your purpose to test a hypothesis, or is it to explore and understand a subjective human experience? So if that's your goal, qualitative research would be appropriate. So in qualitative research, you are relying on words, images, and really focusing on the particular context. Now, it's not meant to be generalizable because it is situated and subjective in that way. So an example would be in ethnography, studying the classroom culture in an Indigenous school. And then mixed research combines elements of both qualitative and quantitative to create a picture that includes elements from both. So an example would be using surveys and interviews to assess teacher satisfaction. So let's get into quantitative research, aka quant. Sometimes you will hear that abbreviation, quant. So quantitative methods prioritizes hypothesis testing, again, trying to confirm or refute predictions or your hypothesis with empirical evidence. So it is definitely parallel to the scientific method that you may have used in school. And it is confirmatory, it's top down. So going back to that idea you learned in chapter 1, confirmatory research starts with a hypothesis, collects data, analyzes the data, and then based on those results, either it confirms the hypothesis or it rejects the hypothesis. Again, it doesn't prove the hypothesis, but it can confirm it with evidence. So the philosophical underpinnings of quantitative research are what we refer to as positivism. We are assuming that there is an objective reality that can be deduced, that can be identified, that can be found through empirical research. Search for the truth, meaning one truth, and quantitative research can help us do that. Another assumption is that society in the world is regular and predictable, and therefore we can use these methods to understand it. So we might have numerical description, we might have causal explanation, or even prediction as one of the goals. Remember how I talked about the goals needing to be aligned? Now, how it is observed. So the researcher will control a particular behavior or phenomenon to isolate the effect of one variable on another. So an example research question would be, what is the effect of X on Y? And then they control it because they only want to know the impact of that one variable. Types of data. So they have, the data are their variables, quantitative variables, and there are both numerical variables and categorical variables. There is a great figure in the text. It's table maybe 2.3, 2.2, but maybe 2.3. So I didn't include it in the slides, but be sure that you look for that in the text. The table that has a list of numerical data or categorical data. A common misconception I see is that quantitative research is numerical. And that's true because it does rely on statistical analysis for analyzing the data. However, it can use categorical data. So it could use test scores, which would be numerical data. survey data, which would be numerical, but it can also use demographic information like age, income level. So it's, well, I guess those those are both numerical, but there are demographic information that's not. For instance, region that you live in, for instance, your gender. So there's plenty of the school that you go to. So there's plenty of different demographic data that is categorical and not numeric, that is still a quantitative variable. So make sure that you look at that. Now, how we determine that quantitative research is valid is through controlling variables to isolate them and make sure that we have understood that. And generalizable, we already know that one of the goals of quantitative research is to generate knowledge, either basic research, applied research, evaluation research that can be generalized to a greater population. Now, two types of quantitative research are experimental and non-experimental. And so experimental is probably what you are most familiar with those science fair projects and the scientific method. So experimental research, one thing that's the same about both experimental research and non-experimental research is they both have a control group and an experimental group. And we're going to do a whole chapter about this in the future. This is just an introduction. So experimental research, you have manipulation of the independent variable, whereas non-experimental research, you don't, because it's probably not ethical. Some of the ideas to pay attention to in the text are extraneous variables and confounding variables. These are concepts that we're going to be coming to and back to throughout the course. And then also this idea of random assignment. So in experimental research, you have to randomly assign the participants to different groups. Now, another important distinction between experimental and non-experimental research is the purpose. Experimental research can collect an evidence of cause and effect relationships, but because non-experimental research does not have manipulation, it cannot claim cause and effect, but it can collect evidence to establish correlations. So let's talk about correlations. Oh, not yet. Okay, so experimental research, an example would be a randomized controlled trial examining the effect of active learning on math performance, whereas non-experimental would be observing the difference in student test performance based on socioeconomic status without assigning groups. So we are not randomly assigning them, and obviously socioeconomic status, that's not something that you can manipulate. Although I'm sure many researchers would love to be able to do that. Okay, so in terms of the strength, we talked about experimental research is able to demonstrate causation, and non-experimental research is able to demonstrate correlation. And non-experimental research is really important in education because there's many great studies where it would be unethical for the researcher to manipulate the independent variable. And so therefore, non-experimental research is a great choice. So in non-experimental research, which again is very common in educational research, so you will likely see this throughout the course, or perhaps you've already seen it and now this will help you understand it a little bit better, is this concept of correlation. So in confirmatory research and quantitative research, it's all about understanding the relationship between one variable and another variable. And so when we look at correlation, it can both tell us the strength of the relationship between those variables and the direction of the relationship between those variables. So correlations are a number. So they are in between 0 and 1 or 0 and -1. So they will be a decimal. So when you see those, they will look like that. And there's some examples in the text. So I wish I hadn't put numbers here, but that's okay. So you can have a positive correlation. And what that means is as one variable increases, so does the other. So this graph gives us an example of a positive correlation. So here we can see that as the SAT scores increase, so do the high school GPAs. So these dots represent participants in the study. So in this quantitative study, the research question was probably, what is the relationship between high school GPA and SAT scores? So they collected participants, they made a table, here's your GPA, here's your SAT score, and then they plotted all those dots. So all of these different dots represent participants, and the researcher has drawn this line. You would use a computer program to do so, to generate a number. Now, this is a positive correlation because, again, as one score increases, so does the other. Now, so in this, okay, so a negative correlation, so both of these show that there is a relationship between the variables. So both of these would be considered good findings because they are evidence that the researcher's hypothesis, they're evidence that to support the researcher's hypothesis. So this one is showing that there's a relationship, and this one is showing that there's a relationship too. Even though it's negative, it's still showing that there's a relationship. So this one, the relationship is between how much cholesterol you consume and your life expectancy. And so the hypothesis that you'll live longer the less that you consume. And so again, you can see the participants here. This person lived to be very old and they consumed very little cholesterol. And then this person consumed a lot of cholesterol and did not live as long. So this is a negative correlation. So both of these, again, one is positive, they both increase, negative, one increases while the other decreases. So I would like for you, if you can think of what's an example of something that's a positive correlation and then something that is a negative correlation. Now, I don't think I have a slide for this, but make sure that you look at this too in the text. So zero correlation would be there's no relationship. So an example of that, height does not correlate to test performance. So we have the direction and we also have the strength. So the strength is this. Let me get a visual for this. So the strength is how closely to this line the dots are. So okay, so this is helpful. So thinking about the strength of correlation. So these are two of the charts from the text. So the correlation, like I mentioned, is a number. So if your correlation is 0, it's a weak relationship. This is what it looks like. There's no relationship between your two variables. So this would be the example, I think it was height and grades. There's no relationship. That's a 0. Now, the closer you get to +1 or -1, that's a strong correlation. So this would be an exactly perfectly positive correlation, and this is a perfectly negative correlation. Now, they're never exactly perfect. It might be 0.9. That would be a really strong correlation, or 0.99 or -0.99. That would be a super strong correlation. So anything over here, -0.8, -0.9, -0.99, that is a strong correlation. Now, a weak correlation is here, 0.75 or -0.75. This is where 0.75 is. This is where -0.75 is. Those are moderately strong correlations. Now, here in the middle, 0.5, 0.5 here, and -0.5, those are pretty weak correlations. And then a very weak correlation would be like -0.3 or +0.3. Now, what can confuse you here is if you are comparing, like, what's a stronger correlation, 0.5 or -0.6? 0.5 or -0.6? Well, -0.6 would be a stronger correlation because it's closer to -1 than 0.5 is to 1. So there are a few questions like that for you here, but I just wanted to add that so we can go over that. Okay, so on to qualitative research. Now, this is the type of research that I do most often. So if you have questions, I would love to talk about it. So qualitative research is also known as quantitative, qualitative. And so its characteristic, it is the exploratory bottom up. The researcher is constructing knowledge through findings identified through data collected through field work. So philosophical underpinnings, the world is constructed. We have subjective realities that the whole goal of research and knowledge is to search for individual group truth or experience. Truth, lowercase t, is situational. Society, the world is contextual and unpredictable. So the goals are to describe, understand, explore. And it's important that the observation is done in natural settings and real world situations. And the goal is to attempt to understand insider's perspective, experiential. How do X experience Y? What are X's perspectives on Y? And it relies on qualitative data that comes from interviews, observations, open-ended questionnaires, documents. It doesn't have variables and it doesn't need a control group or anything like that. Analysis is thematic analysis, identifying categories and themes through repeated readings and coding of data, and it does not use statistics. Now, in terms of how it is established as reliable and valid, it uses a term called trustworthiness. So that's the goal. So researchers use multiple different types of data sources. They use thick description to indicate, to show their points that they are trying to, the patterns and the findings that they have found. They use member checking and then transparency of the researcher's subjectivity. So they acknowledge their own position and their perspective and how that impacts the research that they are collecting. And that fits in with the overall goal of the research, which is particularist findings, trying to reveal insights about a specific perspective or phenomenon. So some of the major characteristics of qualitative research, the table in the text goes through all 12. I'm just going to talk about a few here. So again, naturalistic inquiry, real world situations as they naturally unfold. Emergent design, again, it's bottom up. They start with their research questions, then they go out and they let the data lead them instead of starting with a hypothesis and testing it. Purposeful sampling, so when they are looking for participants, they are searching for participants who meet a series of criteria because that is who they are interested in understanding to get that deep insight. They make sure that they assume that each case is unique and they describe the context of their setting in depth and understand that that's important in their analysis as well. Personal experience and engagement, it involves researchers' direct contact and personal insight with the participants in order to collect the data and analyze it. And it really relies on the practice of reflexivity. And reflexivity is when the researcher reflects on their own voice, their own perspective, and their biases. And a credible voice conveys authenticity and trustworthiness in their research. So the text also talks about 5 major types of qualitative research. Just like I said, we're going to revisit experimental versus non-experimental. We are going to revisit these types as well. We have phenomenology that focuses on lived experiences to understand the essence of a phenomenon. We have case study, which is an in-depth examination of a single case, as we call it. Ethnography, which is focused on cultural practices and understanding cultures. Grounded theory that collects data to try to establish theory based on a systematic qualitative data analysis protocol. And then narrative inquiry, which relies on stories to understand how people construct meaning. And then we have mixed research that integrates both qual and quant. And so it's both confirmatory and exploratory. Its philosophical underpinnings are based on pluralism and an appreciation of both the objective and the subjective. Also, the idea of pragmatism, what works based on what is trying to be understood. They understand that society is partially predictable with multiple influences. And some of the goals are explanation and to understand. And so mixed research can be really useful for explanation because you could use, for instance, quantitative design to test a hypothesis and then qualitative to further explore that and explain why that relationship exists between the variables. You are trying to understand multiple contexts and factors as they operate together. Of course, both quantitative and qualitative data. And for the analysis, they analyze the data separately and then also together to understand what is the interaction between the qualitative and the quantitative data and what is revealed through analyzing it that way. Its reliability and validity is based on legitimation, and that again relates to the interaction. And it uses both a subjective insider and objective outsider viewpoints in order to generalize. Now, these are the two core principles in the text of mixed research. The first being the fundamental principle that combining them strategically is important and that it becomes more synergistic. Ensures a mixture of convergent and divergent approaches to capture complementary strengths and minimize weaknesses, because all research designs, paradigms, and methods have both strengths and weaknesses. And so that is one of the fundamental principles of mixed research, is that through combining them, you can maximize the strengths. But it is also important that the strengths be complementary, that they are integrating diverse methodologies that will help broaden and deeper their insights. And so I will leave you with this visual at the end of chapter 2. This is a research typography that the authors will continue to build on, but this can be a visual that you can help use to help you visually sort and in your brain categorize the different research types that we are talking about. So the first level, the 1, 2, and 3, are the research paradigm, the methodology, the methodological design. So we have quantitative, qualitative, and mixed research. And then below that, we have the research method within that. I would call these the methodology, but I didn't write this text. So quantitative, we have experimental, non-experimental. There's more, but those are two main ones. With mixed research, there is concurrent and sequential, of course, other types. These are two that we will read about. And then here are the 5 types of qualitative that we will learn about in this class. So please share your thoughts and perusal, and I look forward to reading your comments and annotations.